What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue here with my 2024 college football schedule preview and projected record series. The South Carolina Gamecocks are up next before we preview their schedule for 2024 and give them an early projected record based on how tough their schedule is. Let's take a look back at what South Carolina did in 2023. Here were my projections and predictions last year for the South Carolina Gamecocks. My projection had them at 8-4, and then my prediction for them was 7-5. So I did have a little bit of a difference there with my projection and prediction for this team last year. South Carolina was way under that though compared to my projection and predictions last year. This team went 5-7 in 2023. So they did miss out on a bowl game last year. It really wasn't just about the overall record. Yes, it was a very disappointing season for South Carolina, a team that went 8-4 the year before, but it wasn't really just about the record. It was really about the schedule for South Carolina. Here was the schedule last year in 2023, and you look at their non-conference schedule, had a couple of tough non-conference games with North Carolina and Clemson, both of those teams out of the ACC from last year. Those were very tough games there in the non-conference. They ended up losing both of those games in the non-conference, and then you look at the rest of those 7 losses here for South Carolina coming in the SEC. They lost to Georgia and Tennessee both here in the month of September. Lost to Florida here at home in a close one. Lost to Missouri and Texas A&M both on the road there in the month of October. And then again, you count the non-conference games. Those are the rest of the losses there in the 7 losses for South Carolina. Again with North Carolina and Clemson. So again, a very tough schedule last year for South Carolina. They do have a tough schedule every year. Let's now look ahead to 2024. Here is the schedule for the Gamecocks for this upcoming season. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who they will play in the non-conference this upcoming season. So this is their non-conference schedule. They will play Old Dominion, Akron, and then, of course, Wofford here. So they got 3 easy non-conference games. And then, of course, you do play Clemson here on the road. Again, that's a rivalry game that they play every single year. And it is, of course, in Death Valley this year. It was last year at home, so this time they will play them on the road. Remember, a couple years ago, South Carolina defeated Clemson on the road, so they could do that again this year. But again, that's going to be a very tough place to play. But again, not a tough non-conference schedule compared to last year in 2023, but that's the non-conference schedule for 2024. Let's go back to the schedule now here for South Carolina and go game by game now. So they will kick things off with Old Dominion here on August 31st in their non-conference game, and then after that they open up SEC play here on the road at Kentucky here on September the 7th. Tough place to, or actually not a tough place to play, but a tough game to start out the SEC play, and then they play LSU here at home on September the 14th in week number 3. Then they come back here at home again to play Akron, their second non-conference game here on September 21st, and then they get a bye week here at the last weekend of the month of the September. And then they come out of the bye week, they'll get to the month of October, they'll play Ole Miss here at home on October the 5th. Then they go on the road here to play Alabama on October the 12th. Then it's on the road at Oklahoma here on October the 19th. So one of those newcomers in the SEC, they will play Oklahoma here on the road. And you got back-to-back road games here for South Carolina. On the road here at Alabama and on the road here at Oklahoma in the month of October. That's really a tough back-to-back when you have to play back-to-back road games here in back-to-back weeks. Then they get another bye week here. They get their second bye week here in the last weekend in the month of October. Then they get to the month of November. They'll play Texas A&M here at home on November 2nd. Then they go on the road here to play Vanderbilt on November 9th. Then it's back at home here with their last SEC matchup with Missouri here on November 16th. And then they play 2 non-conference games to to end out the year. They play Wofford here on November the 23rd. And then they close things out with Clemson here on the road in rivalry weekend on November 30th. So another tough schedule for South Carolina in 2024. In my opinion, those back-to-back road games with Alabama and Oklahoma are very tough. And then you got LSU and Ole Miss. But the good news here that you get those 2 games at home. Those are the good news there. You do got to play Kentucky here on the road. But again, it's not really a brutal schedule like it was last year in 2023. But let's get to the projection now based on this schedule. And again, this is not my official prediction. This is simply a projection based on how tough the schedule is. And this is the scale I use here for my projections. If it's a 1% game in the red, that percentage is counted as an automatic loss there in the red. 20% game games in the orange are going to be games where South Carolina will be about a couple touchdowns of underdogs. 40% games in the yellow, they're going to be a slight underdog in those games by about a touchdown there, and also a heavy underdog at 40% in the yellow. 50-50 games will stay in the white, of course, games that I think can go either way. 60% games in the purple are going to be games where South Carolina will be favored by at least a touchdown. 80% games in the blue are going to be games where South Carolina will be favored by a couple touchdowns and also by double digits. And then the 99% games here in the green, these are pretty much counted as the automatic wins here. They're not guaranteed wins, but they're counted as automatic wins here when we do these projections. So we'll start with the green games here for South Carolina for 2024. 99% games here in the green that are counted as automatic wins. And I think you've got 3 of them on here that you can favor South Carolina by more than 3 touchdowns. Old Dominion, Akron, and Wofford, 3 out of your 4 non-conference games here in the green. I think all these games, South Carolina will be favored by more than 3 touchdowns. Maybe you can make an argument that Old Dominion and Wofford both of those games will be in the 90% range, but I think Akron is definitely over 95%. Old Dominion and Wofford could be a little bit challenging, but again, South Carolina should go ahead and take care of business in all 3 of these games. And like I said, these are not guaranteed wins, but they count as automatic wins here when we do these projections for these teams. So I think South Carolina will be favored in all 3 of these games by more than 3 touchdowns. I don't have any blue games on here for South Carolina. I don't think anywhere on the SEC schedule there's not really any other games that you can favor South Carolina by at least a couple of touchdowns. Let's go to the games now in the purple. The games where South Carolina will be favored by at least a touchdown here in the purple at 60%. I do have one game on here in the purple, and that's on the road here at Vanderbilt on November 9th. I think the Gamecocks will be favored here on the road at Vanderbilt. The reason why this is a purple game, though, is just because it's on the road at Vanderbilt. If this game was a home game for South Carolina, I would definitely put it in the blue, but I'm going to stick with it here and put it in the purple just because it's on the road in Nashville, Tennessee. Vanderbilt is a team I don't really expect to be all that good this year. They're probably one of the worst teams in the SEC coming up this year. And I just think South Carolina has a more talented roster than Vanderbilt comparison-wise. So South Carolina, I think, will be favored by at least a touchdown there on the road at Vanderbilt. Let's go to the games now where South Carolina will be underdogs in. I don't have any red games on here for automatic losses for South Carolina, but I do have some games here in the orange at 20%, the games where there'll be about a couple touchdowns of underdogs. And those couple games are on here, and that's Alabama and Oklahoma in these back-to-back road games. With it being, road games and all, that's the reason why I decided to put South Carolina as a couple touchdowns of underdogs. Alabama and Oklahoma are very tough places to play. And again, you have to play them in both back-to-back weeks, and that's really a tough spot there in the month of October for South Carolina. That's what makes the schedule a little bit tougher for South Carolina as well, not just like in the other SEC games, but also here in these back-to-back road games. And I know Alabama's got a coaching change and everything, but it's still a very tough place to play at Bryant-Denny Stadium. We don't know how good Oklahoma is going to be in their first year in the SEC, but I think roster-wise, I think, Oklahoma has a better roster than South Carolina as well. So that's the reason why both of these games are in the orange, just because they're both on the road. And not going to say that South Carolina is going to lose both of these games. I think they do have a chance to compete at least a little bit in these games. But as of right now, I'm going to put both of these games in the orange just because they're both on the road. And then we go to the games now where South Carolina will be about a touchdown of an underdog at 40% here in the yellow. And I got a couple games on here in the yellow. I got LSU and Ole Miss. Both of these games are at home here for South Carolina. LSU is definitely a very winnable game when you got that game at home. LSU is going to lose some talent on the roster from last year with Jaden Daniels gone at quarterback, but still, South Carolina I think will be an underdog just because of the talent-wise. And then same thing here with Ole Miss. I think Ole Miss has a little bit of a slight talented roster than South Carolina does, but again, both of these games in the yellow are not automatic losses. They are definitely very winnable games. These are 2 games where South Carolina has a chance to compete in both of these games. Again, that's the reason why they're both in the yellow, and also the reason why they're both in the yellow is just because they're playing here at home. So, and the good news about, the Ole Miss game is you get a bye week right there before that game playing at home on October the 5th. So maybe that does help you out just a little bit if you're a South Carolina fan. So both of these games, I think South Carolina will be a slight underdog in both of these games. Again, LSU and Ole Miss here in the yellow. And then the rest of the 4 games here for South Carolina: Kentucky on the road, Texas A&M here at home, Missouri here at home, and then Clemson here on the road. I think both of these games, all four of these games, I should say, are 50-50 games here for South Carolina. They definitely can go either way. Kentucky is a pretty tough one here to call. You know, if it was at home for South Carolina, I definitely would favor the Gamecocks here just because they beat Kentucky last year. But with it being on the road, and this is a very tight matchup, it's always like a pretty good matchup here between these two teams. So I think South Carolina and Kentucky is a 50-50 game. Texas A&M and Missouri, those are pretty both even matchups, even though Texas A&M and Missouri are both here at home for South Carolina. Again, those are very tight games there. I think they can go either way. And then, of course, Clemson here on the road, that's a rivalry game. You never know what can happen. So, again, all four of these games in the 50-50 range. I think all these games can go either way here for South Carolina. You got two 50-50 games here at home with Texas A&M and Missouri. And then you got Clemson and Kentucky in 50-50 games here, both on the road. So let's now get a projected record here for South Carolina for 2024. Again, not my official prediction. This is simply a projection based on how tough the schedule is. So we count those green games as automatic wins, and then you count that one purple game. You average that out at 60% here in the purple, and then you average out a couple of those orange games at 20%. Then you average out those yellow games, a couple of those yellow games at 40%, and then you average out all the 50-50 games here at 50%. And the overall projected record that you get for South Carolina for 2024 is 6-6 here based on this schedule for South Carolina. So not a bad projection for South Carolina. It's really just based off of the schedule and everything. It is a very tough schedule for 2024. But again, a 6-6 projected record. It's a little bit lower than last year. But again, South Carolina, if they're going to, find a way to get to a bowl game, they do have some very winnable games here on the schedule, especially with those yellow games and obviously those white games there with Kentucky, Texas A&M, Missouri, and Clemson. But again, if they do beat one of those teams in the yellow, LSU or Ole Miss, they're definitely going to make it to a bowl game. But if they don't, I think it's going to be a very tough season for South Carolina. But again, a 6-6 projected record based on how tough this schedule is. I think best case scenario would definitely have to be 7-5. And it would really shock me if this team did go 8-4, but it wouldn't really shock me if this team did go like 7-5 or 6-6. And then, of course, worst case scenario, I think would definitely have to be 5-7 or 4-8. If this team did go 4-8 or 5-7, that definitely would be a very big disappointment for South Carolina fans. But again, a 6-6 projection is the record here for 2024 for the South Carolina Gamecocks. Give me your thoughts on this South Carolina team down in the comments below. What do you think their projected record is for 2024? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned here for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports Channel.